front row is so close. It's very intimate.
I love how you put very few chairs out, so it looks like there's a lot of demand. That was awesome.
Well, as you heard, this wasn't the intended room.
Sorry?
We're usually in a room upstairs, which is
nice and cozy.
a little less cavernous and.
Well, I don't think this is cavernous.
Yeah.
Yeah. How about can we do it a little bit lower so it's just not, I can look at people? Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much. Okay.
So is this
Yeah, so this is a.
public high school? I didn't understand.
No, this is a private Jewish high school, modern Orthodox.
Got it. That's
That,
connected to the synagogue?
no, we rent.
I see.
Yeah.
I see. Gotcha.
In 2 years' time, hopefully, we'll have our own
And where is the
space.
new synagogue?
We're going to build on essentially La Cienega and 18th. So between Airdrome and 18th, there's a strip there with our offices, 2 motels that you don't want to spend any time in.
So those are coming down.
Those are coming down. So we've acquired 3 adjacent properties.
Right. Right.
IKAR offices, synagogue.
Great.
Wow. That's great. For congregation members? No, I'm teasing. No, I'm teasing.
Do you know there are 100,000 Jews in LA living below the poverty line?
People don't appreciate it.
It's crazy. It's still a problem, apparently. There's still 100,000 Jews in the city that are below the poverty line.
Oh, I'm sure. No, I mean, if you talk to the folks at UJA or JDC, at UJA or JDC, they will all talk about low-income Jews. And then partly in the Orthodox community, it's bonkers.
Yeah.
I mean, really a problem.
That's a whole
I mean,
other
heavily
issue.
reliant on government aid and.
Yeah, sure.
Sure.
Let's start.
I recognize it's a little bit of a subset from the lunch crowd. I just want to say that.
What's that?
It's a slight subset from the lunch crowd.
I know. It's true.
What do you mean?
Smaller group than lunch.
Yeah.
Which is
all right.
more appealing, lunch or us?
Right.
Lunch.
I know. It's tough competition. It's tough competition. Which is why we try to give them a chance to eat before.
Otherwise, you'd have 0.
Head on head.
Exactly.
It's all right.
It's all good.
הנה מה טוב ומה נעים שבת האחים גם יחד הנה מה טוב שבת האחים גם יחד. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Was that how your interview on Good Morning America started also?
Exactly.
Well, we finished ours with Ein Kalahina, so it was okay.
But the Ladino version or the
No,
traditional?
it was straight
they're
up.
more of a traditional crowd at Good Morning America.
Yeah, the tune was different than here, but the words were the same.
The sentiment was the same.
Yeah. All right. Well, I guess in sort of Jewish hospitality function, this is, I guess, your third welcome today. So we welcomed you with an aliyah, we welcomed you with announcements, but I really am so grateful to you, both for coming and being part of this conversation today, for writing this book, From Mistakes to Meaning, which...
It's available for sale in hardcover, I would point out, Rabbi.
Do you like my...
I mean, I just want to say this.
You don't like my not-for-distribution copy over here?
This was going pretty well until now.
Well, actually, Susan Brooks, our program director, just reminded me, I kind of buried the lead, which is that you brought books.
We did.
You brought books, which we hope everyone will walk out with a copy of their own book. And
if it wasn't Shabbos, we would sign them.
Exactly. So thank you for the gift of the book. Thank you for the gift of writing the book. You all now know that I'm not going to open this Lunch and Learn with a list of their accomplishments and accolades. Instead, I want to open But part of what I enjoyed about the book was that there was a little bit of a feeling of this is a like detective genre. I felt like I was along the ride with you all, going on a journey of discovery around the mistakes that you made, around the mistakes that others make and that we generally make, and that there was what to be found. The closer you looked, the deeper you looked. But I want to start first having you talk a little bit about your friendship, how the two of you know each other, and maybe where the detective story in a way begins, or at least one act of it, which is a fateful walk on the beach during COVID. So tell us a little bit about your friendship and what happened on that beach.
Should I? Sure. So, first of all, thank you very much for having us, Rabbi and everybody here. And the service this morning was really wonderful. I used to be at Oratora, and I know that a bunch of folks have come over here at IKAR, and it's beautiful to see what you've built. It really is. Josh and I have been friends now for over 20 years, and we have kids about the same age. We live near one another. We've been good friends for all that time. But I will say this process has really brought us even closer together. Just the process of exploring these mistakes and talking to people. It really began when it was right around COVID, and Josh and I were taking a walk on the beach, exactly as you indicated. And Josh had said to me, you know, Michael, I know you made a big mistake about 5 years ago, which was the mistake that resulted in the Sony hack. But every time I try and talk to you about it in any way, shape, or form, you basically duck out of the conversation. You want nothing to do with it. And I don't think that's a healthy thing to be doing. And I have a mistake myself that I'm doing something very similar with. And I think maybe we should go through consider writing a book and going through a procedure and process where we talk to other people about their mistakes and somehow figure out how we can grapple with both the mistakes themselves but also the aftermath of it. And that's really how the whole thing began.
How did that conversation on the beach go? Was it warm and fuzzy right away, or did it take time to warm up into the depth of what you actually wanted to be talking about?
Given that we're in a Jewish day school and it's Shabbos, I won't swear, but Michael's initial reaction was, I would say, not quite as warm and fuzzy as
That's fair.
His recitation 5 years later. And, you know, I think the thing about this is we all get annoyed by other people most often when we see something in them that we don't like about ourselves, right? And that has a very powerful, I think, at least for me, emotional reaction. And so when Michael's hesitancy, which was reasonably profound in the beginning.
Like, get away from me.
Yeah, that kind of hesitancy with a few other F-bombs in there. I got upset, and I was like, what's wrong with you? Like, you should be willing to do this, and why aren't you willing to unpack it? Why aren't you willing to explore it? And I think I was reacting that way, not entirely, but primarily because for 25 years I had refused to do the same thing myself.
All right, so let's dig in. We are now the beneficiaries of 5+ years of work that you've done investigating the mistakes that you made, the backstories, what led to those mistakes, what happened in the aftermath of those mistakes. So I want to give each of you a chance to share whatever it is you want to share this afternoon about the mistakes you made, the consequences of those mistakes, and what you learned from them.
Well, maybe it's helpful to start off with the mistakes themselves.
Sure.
So what I explored, and we were talking earlier about this, was the singular decision to make this movie, The Interview, which is a comedy involving Seth Rogen, who I know is a member of this congregation. And Seth had come to us with a movie that was designed as an R-rated comedy about where two hapless journalists, played by himself and James Franco, go at the direction of the CIA to North Korea, ostensibly to interview Kim Jong-un, but really the reason for it is to assassinate Kim Jong-un. And we were in a competitive situation in that moment with Universal, because we had made a lot of movies with Seth, Universal had made a lot of movies with Seth, and we knew that if we weren't going to say yes, they were going to say yes. And everybody involved on the creative side of the business, Amy Pascal, who I know also and is still a dear friend of mine who's a member of this congregation, she was all on board with it. And normally what we would have done was we had created a process where we all get around a table, finance, marketing, the creative folks, and collectively determine whether this was a good or bad idea. And there was a process of real deliberation. But that didn't happen in this case. What happened was everybody wanted to make the movie. We were under a tight time schedule. We decided to do a read-through of the script with the actors. Everybody in the room was sort of dressed casually, except for me. I always wore a suit. I was literally the suit. And I was actually the only person who stood between the movie getting made and not.
I gave him the advice not to wear a suit today.
It was good advice.
Yeah.
And anyway, so the read-through went brilliantly. Everybody was, high-fiving each other at the end, saying how funny it was and saying, let's make it. And for the first time, I'd been in the job then for about a decade, I said, you know what? I just want to be a part of this group. I'm going to say yes. And in that moment of enthusiasm, in that moment of letting go, I made a giant mistake by agreeing to make that movie. So that's my story. We can get into, what resulted in it was really terrible. The North Koreans wound up hacking our systems. All of our computers were destroyed. People's personal lives were put out on the internet, mine included. People lost their jobs. It was about 6 months of hell that came out of that. Josh, do you want to?
So
You want me to comment on your hell, or do you want me to know?
No, we'll come back to it.
Yeah. Well, Michael was making frivolous movies. I was in the government doing the Lord's work. That's how I would describe it. No. So at a young age, I was the chief of staff at the Treasury Department when I was 28. And as you alluded to, Rabbi, the first few years of the Clinton administration, no disrespect to the congregation, normally I have to describe who Clinton was. I think with this group, I don't have to make that explanation. And as you recall, there was a certain level of controversy on a weekly basis with the president and the first lady occasionally, unfortunately. So one of those was Whitewater, this Arkansas land deal, because it involved a bank regulator. Ultimately, the independent counsel wanted to subpoena the records of the people who worked at Treasury, including myself. I took that subpoena seriously, unsurprisingly, and turned over my professional records, all those things, but also my personal ones, which included both a personal diary and a last letters to my then girlfriend, now wife, which made reference to Whitewater. It's a whole separate issue about whether that's the way to write love letters. And as a result of all of that, I got subpoenaed to testify before the grand jury. My diary had made its way onto the front page of the New York Times. I testified before Congress. And it was in that really sweet spot between really humiliating and utterly embarrassing.
So there's a temptation to tell the story exactly as the two of you just did, right?
Yeah.
Starting and ending with, in a sense, the moment of crisis, right? The moment in which you made a decision that you wish you would not have made. But that's not where you went in this book, right? You understood that there are multiple acts, right, to the story of the mistakes that you made. And that what you each just described, you would label, I think, as Act 2, right? So
you read the book carefully.
I read the book carefully. Lots of notes here. If it gets subpoenaed, I'm confident in. No, too soon, Josh. So tell us a little bit about the other two acts, right? Act 1 and Act 3, and how those relate to the moment of the mistake.
Right. So to back up for one moment, when we decided to embark on this, when I finally got over my whatever I was getting over that Josh was referring to, we sort of jumped into the process to write about a couple of other mistakes that we had done before we got to the main event. And we realized in the process that, A, there wasn't anything written about mistakes up until that point. There was a lot of books written about failures, and failures are different things from mistakes, and we'll come on to that. But we also didn't really have a process to explore them. Mm-hmm. We enlisted the help of a psychologist from Johns Hopkins, Alison Papadakis, who's been incredible. And she basically guided us to know the academic literature, but also to help us unpack how actually these things happen. So we would write about our mistake, we would all read the mistake, and Alison was the one, along with Josh to me and me to Josh, to say, when we're trying to understand what was the impulse that got you to make that decision in the moment. And it was a little bit like unpacking one of those Russian dolls. You kept going deeper and deeper in. It's almost like psychoanalysis. In fact, it was a version of that. And as a result of that process, we came up with a bunch of ideas about how these mistakes happen, one of which is what you're referring to, which is this 3-act structure. Basically, what comes before the mistake that informs how you come to the decision to make the mistake itself, and equally importantly, the shame that you experience and the desire to sort of put it away from you at the end. And those are really the 3 acts, wouldn't you say?
So would you be willing to share what you discovered about yourselves as you pulled Russian dolls out from outside to inside? What was at the core, and what were the different layers?
Sure. I think one of the things that's helpful probably, and it's obviously very relevant to today's Parsha, but probably be relevant for every Parsha, is that when we started this, our assumption was that we were going to come up with buckets of mistakes. And you start listing them, and before long we had 60 plus mistakes, because there's all the ones you think as the 7 deadly sins, greed, gluttony, but you keep going through it, and there are more and more sins that you began to label and to try to identify, and then we tried to come up with buckets, and we thought originally we would organize the books around these classifications of mistakes. And specifically to your question, we realized that the only commonality that we were really most curious about is what they revealed about our personalities and who we were as people. That it was less interesting in a way whether the manifestation of that was through greed or anger or gluttony. That wasn't really what was most interesting. We were interested in what came and became revealed about ourselves. And Allison educated us on this really essential element for the book, which is this idea of a schema, which is that each of us are formed in different ways, and we have experiences which shape us and shape our personalities. Sometimes very early in life, sometimes you have a seminal experience in your first job, wherever it might be. And often these mistakes reveal an aspect of your schema. And I'll just give you one way to think about, or 2 ways to think about that schema, because it's an essential element of how we thought about the problem. As Michael alluded to, one of the things that Allison did was introduced us to relevant academic literature. And there's a great study on this to help you understand it. So academics took a group of people and they got volunteers, and they said, we're going to do a study one by one, but before we do the study, could you just wait over here in this office and just sit there for a little while? They'd bring the volunteer out, and then they would ask the volunteer questions about that office and what they remembered about seeing in the office. And the volunteers were much more likely to remember things from that office, which they associate with an office, a computer, books, a desk, than they were things they didn't expect to see in an office. And not only that, they remembered things which didn't actually even exist, because they had a mental template of what an office should be. And these schemas, these ways we go through the world, are essential. Like, you get into an elevator, and if there are 2 people, you both go to the sides. If there are 4, you each go into the corner. If there's 5, right? If there's a 5th person, she or he goes into the middle. And if you didn't know how to do that, it'd be so embarrassing every time you got into the elevator. Someone would be crowded up next to you. So these schemas are enormously helpful, but they also can lead you astray. And so part of what we really tried to figure out was, what was the underlying schema for each of us that was revealed through this mistake? And we'll get into it. And as we introduced other people to this idea and began to interview them about it, what was the schema that was driving a lot of their mistakes?
So maybe give us some examples of what kinds of schema you discovered, either within yourselves or, as I mentioned earlier, part of the structure of the book is that you interviewed 10 or so, individuals, all of whom have been successful in their careers, who are accomplished in their own right, and instead of, as I said before, asking them about their accolades, you ask them about their mistakes. And in each chapter, part of the journey of discovery is towards the underlying schema that then, was sort of running in the background, often, quietly without maybe their knowledge of it, but that had, everything to do with the mistake that they made. So what were some of the schema you encountered?
Do you want to talk about yours, Schmidt?
Yeah, it's maybe helpful just to talk about my schema.
Great.
Perhaps. But
yeah.
To your point, we interviewed a lot of different people, and actually most people were successful in their career, but some were not, and they represent all variety of schema. But in my case, what happened was, and again, it took a while to figure this out, what was that impulse that wanted me to say yes in that moment and be part of that group? And when I really thought about it, I've always had this desire, although I don't always show it, to be to be part of the cool group, and I've always had a degree, in fact, a big degree of FOMO, this fear of missing out. And I couldn't ever put my finger on why that thing nagged at me. And what we sort of got to the bottom of was when I was 8 or 9 years old, I was living in New York, in Westchester County, and my parents, who themselves were immigrants to the United States, moved my sister and I to Holland, to the Netherlands. Lived in September, and they just threw us right into the school system there. It's an experience they had themselves in the 40s when they had moved from Europe, so they didn't think much of it. But I didn't speak the language, and I didn't obviously know anybody, and it made me, I was very, very lonely for those first few years trying to get myself situated and everything else. And that was what actually informed that schema in that moment, because it really got me to a place where I was always thinking, I want to be part of that group. I am not part of that group. How do I become a part of that group? And I think in fact, I know, having gone through this process, that was the schema, the impulse that drove the mistake. And that was a very revealing part of who I am and what motivated me in that moment.
Just to pick up on that, and I'm a little bit obsessed with these, and Michael's often like, enough of the academic studies, so if you start rolling your eyes.
No, they're useful.
But just to give you a sense of this, because this is why, at least we found so fascinating about this process, is that we would have some reaction and we'd try to think, okay, is this universal or is this specific to each of us? And one good example is on this issue about peer pressure. So there was a guy named Solomon Asch in the 1950s who did a very famous study at Swarthmore. And he took volunteers, and he didn't tell them that they would be paired and grouped with professional actors. And they would go into a room, and each of them would be given 2 cards. On one card would be 3 lines of different lengths. On the other card was 1 line, which was the same length as one of the other 3. And the people running the study would say to the people, okay, the card with 1 line on it is the same length as one of the others. Is it A, B, or C? And when the professional actors lied and said it was C when it was actually B, 75% of the time, the volunteers lied and got it wrong. And you think to myself, that's an incredible example of how groups of people can influence other people's thinking. They then went back and redid the study using MRIs. They put people into an MRI, and they did the same study, both to validate it and make sure that it was true many, many years later. And what was amazing is not only did they validate it, but when people were lying, the part of the brain that got activated was the part that we use for spatial reasoning. They thought they were telling the truth. They didn't think that they were misrepresenting what's going on. And so these groups of people can have an incredible impact. We all know it from peer pressure in movies, and we might even know it from today's Parsha, Rabbi. If you think about what Aaron was going on, right? Groups of people, when they get together and they're fearful, they're scared, they want to belong, it goes back all the way to there. It's been validated by the research. And then Michael experienced it in that moment when they were doing the read-through.
I want to come back to this week's Parsha because I was very excited in our prep call when you said, maybe we'll talk about the Parsha. And I thought to myself, take that, Good Morning America.
You got to know. Context is also very important, and you got to know your audience.
Yeah, exactly. But Michael, I mean, thinking a little bit about the schema that you just shared.
Yep.
You wrote in the book that there was a German expression that your mother used to say to you when you were a kid, something like, you can't jump over your shadow.
Your own shadow.
You can't jump over your own shadow.
My mother, who herself was a psychologist, yes, she used to say, I can say it in the German, but the English translation is, one cannot jump over one's own shadow.
Right. So, and then you sort of you wrote that that's part of what's happening here, right?
Yeah.
That's one way to understand the schema, right? Is that it's a shadow of sorts, and of
You're
course
carrying
Freud
it with you.
writes about this as well.
If only we could talk about metaphors today too.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So the question that I want to ask, this now projects us a little bit, either into the future from 2015. So maybe it's a question about the present, actually, which is, how have you found, right? There's great power, right? Name it to tame it. There's great power in understanding what are the underlying schema, how do they influence us, how might they show up, when are we vulnerable to their power,
Yep.
right? Naming it doesn't necessarily make it go away. I mean, these are, in your case, right? This is a formative childhood experience that shaped how you behave in a whole range of circumstances. now that you have an awareness of this schema, right? Now that you know where the shadow is, how do you interact with it differently?
I think the best way to describe it is the way my wife talks to my kids. I have 3 daughters. All of them now are in their late 20s, early 30s. And what she used to say when they got, which as many kids of that generation are, anxious, she would say to them, "That's not you talking, that's your anxiety talking." Mm-hmm. And in my case, what I came to understand once I could identify that one schema was when all of a sudden that impulse comes up. And by the way, it still comes up all the time. You know, I'd love to go to that party. I want to be in that meeting, all that kind of stuff. I can really separate myself from that impulse and remind myself of there's another way to think about how you're going to approach whatever decision it is you have to make. Mm-hmm. It's that separation that I find so valuable.
So you actually, in the book, the two of you write about a number of strategies, right, that actually help either intercept the autopilot of the schema or that allow you to slow down and think differently. Could you tell us about, and then there's some great acronyms as well, but some strategies and acronyms that have helped you, and that might be helpful to us when you find yourself at the cusp of reverting or falling back into the hole that a schema might entrap you in.
Yeah, there are some shortcuts. I would say that before we got to those, at least it's our view, that the most important part is really what you were discussing. It's the conversation.
Yeah.
And the profound aspect of it for us was really partly because it deepened our friendship and because it allowed us to identify and then ultimately get far more comfortable with the schema that we were traveling around with. So probably our view would be the most important thing is this acronym that we use, which is DUET, because it was a conversation between the two of us. And the D stands for disclose. You have to start by saying, okay, 1 minute, there's something I've done in the past, I'm embarrassed about it, I'm ashamed of it, we can talk about the difference of those two things. But it starts by willingness to say, you know what, I'm not gonna carry this around by myself alone anymore. There's someone in my life with whom I can have a conversation. And even if there isn't, I can at least write it down in a way that will be helpful. That's the D. The second is you have to unpack it, as Michael alluded to, because the first assumption about what happened, we found was almost always wrong. We went there and we figured out, oh, I got it, Michael, this is the answer. And Michael would roll his eyes at me and go, no, that wasn't what's going on. And it's a slow process of unpacking and unraveling these things to try to get to the bottom of it. The third piece of it is empathy. And if someone comes to you and wants to talk about their mistake, you just have to demonstrate empathy, which is very different, especially for men, of describing your own mistake. So try to keep that on the inside and recognize, no, this isn't the moment for you to talk about yours, but demonstrate empathy. And the last part is trust. Trust that the person with whom you're speaking is going to be treated confidentially and treat you with empathy. And trust yourself that when you disclose this thing, people aren't going to think worse of you. They're not going to be hateful. They're not going to be looking to disparage you, but rather they'll probably respect you for your willingness to talk about it.
One of the things I found surprising about your book was that some of the chapters, detailing the stories of others that you interviewed.
Sorry, Robert, can I interrupt for 1 second?
Yeah.
I just think for this group also, many of us have kids, and I do think the modeling part of this is pretty important. Mm-hmm. We have 3 children, and for reasons that escape me, they do care about what I think. And they hold us up. I'm sure it's true for many of your children, in some cases grandchildren. They admire you. They see what you've done, what you've been able to accomplish. And I really do think a big part of our hope for this book is it gives people permission to model this behavior. Mm-hmm. And it starts by modeling it and sharing to them and talking to them about something that you might be carrying around. And by doing that, that gives them permission to then do it themselves.
Absolutely. And I think what it also does is it disrupts the potential formation of a new schema around perfectionism.
Yeah, and we have a lot about that in the book.
Right? If you see a parent, right, who is unwilling to speak vulnerably with their children, and who project a kind of model of love is bound up in my own perfectionism, in my expectation of your perfectionism, and we're never willing to talk about the schmutz that's part of everyday life and the real mistakes that we make. we are often unknowingly contributing to the formation of a schema that could be very damaging.
Yeah, I totally agree. Actually, in all seriousness, we should talk about today's Parsha, because the extraordinary part about this is you're surrounded by mistakes.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, obviously, people of Israel make this terrible mistake. It looks like God's about to make this terrible mistake by just wiping them out. Right? I mean, you're over and over again, and then you see this conversation, really like the thesis of our book, this conversation between Moses and Hashem about what should happen. And there's an assumption by Hashem that he's going to go off and do something. And then we're like, well, no, I'm going to pull that back. And then, okay, he pulls it back, but then Moses decides, well, half measure might be okay. I'm just going to kill 3,000 of them. I mean, it's full of all the things that we were trying to understand.
Yeah. There is a duet going on, right?
There is a duet
between Moshe and God.
In fairness, there's a conductor and there's like a participant, but it is a duet.
There might be a power imbalance.
Yeah, exactly.
But although interestingly, right, as happens throughout the Torah, despite the power imbalance between God and Moses, it's Moses who presents the winning argument again and again, or makes the case for God to shift God's course of action. Right? And then we can have theological debates about what's going on there. Is this actually representative of God changing, and God is creating the pedagogic moment, opportunity for Moses to become the teacher? But since we're on the topic of this week's Parsha, when you mentioned it the other day, I started to think to myself, what was the operating schema for the Israelites that led them to behave the way that they did when Moses was, according to their perspective, one day late coming down the mountain, right? And I'm curious if you have an answer to that. I'm happy to share my thoughts.
I think Josh would be better equipped to answer
Go
that
for
than
it.
I would.
You want to,
You're
or should I? Or I can also share my thinking.
Well, I think one of the things, because I did, like any other, nice Jewish boy who got bar mitzvahed, I did think to myself, okay, I'm not going to show up here without having at least read a little bit about the Parsha. So I did go off and do that. One of the things, to your point, that did interest me, and I apologize if, this probably was your sermon last year or something. There's a reading of what Aaron did, which was a little bit for those people who remember Mutiny on the Bounty, which is, how do you keep people busy and distract them, right? And that's one reading of the Parsha, that Aaron recognizes that there's this crisis, and Moses is missing, and people are getting more and more anxious and distracted and everything else, and he's thinking, okay, I got to keep him busy long enough for Moses to come back, and that he never expected to get all the way to the golden calf, and that his mistake was not actually the golden calf itself, but using a not particularly perfect leadership technique to keep the group together. And it's one of the great things about studying Midrash or Talmud is you go off and find these interpretations, and then you realize it plays itself out in popular literature for thousands of years later in a very similar way to how do you keep groups together in a moment of crisis.
Aaron is described elsewhere in text as, Rodev Shalom ve'ohev Shalom. Aaron was a pursuer of peace and a lover of peace. And it's meant in the rabbinic tradition as praise for Aaron, right? As a quality of leadership that we should aspire to. And yet there is a critique within that description of Aaron as it pertains to this particular incident, which, Josh, I think connects to what you're saying here, which is that, maybe in simpler terms, we'd call Aaron a people pleaser, right? Who didn't actually have the boundariness in that particular moment to say something to the people that would have been hard for them to hear because there was group consensus building about what they wanted to do. And Aaron ought to have said, I recognize the energy that is bubbling up here. I see the excitement. I see the anxiety. I see the worry in the group. Let's take a beat, right? What you're doing is actually heading down a catastrophic road that you don't want to be. But Aaron, that would have meant positioning himself against the entirety of the people in a way that might have been uncomfortable for him and his personality.
And so that was his schema. And then there was another piece in the Haftorah, obviously, about how you shouldn't let your sons marry women who come from a different faith, because ultimately they'll revert back to their faith and they'll bring their husbands with them, right? And so that's religion as a schema where God is instructing the Jews not to marry outside the faith because of how deeply embedded religion is. And that's a form of schema for some people too.
Yeah. This is more than a good Jewish boy if you studied the Haftarah. That's like,
Not me, not me.
That's sort of another layer here, another level. So, okay, so, but since we're now, sort of really in the realm of Jewish thought and how Jewish thought relates to the writing that you've done, I guess I want to ask, in the first chapter of the book, and this connects to something you said earlier, Michael, about what has been written on this topic and what hasn't been written on this topic, and the paths that you needed to pursue in order to develop your understanding of mistakes and of the field more broadly. So there's a section in the first chapter where you kind of go through a number of different religions and a number of different theories about sin or mistakes, really more sin. And that is part of the process of realizing you're going to have to go down a new path. So maybe tell us a little bit about what you found to be the disconnect between the religious orientation to this topic, and it could be Jewish or beyond, and what felt... Why was there a need to head down other paths?
No, I think you should criticize Judaism, Michael. You go right ahead.
That was the implicit part of the question.
It's a little bit, and
know your
I'll
audience.
touch on the surface, but Josh should jump in. As Josh mentioned, there was an effort at the beginning to try and explore mistakes by categorizing them. And when we did that, we created this enormous list, and the list looked very similar, as Josh indicated, to the 7 deadly sins, except in a longer version of it. But that's really a morality tale more than it is anything else. And that's not really what we were going for. We were trying to understand what is the emotional impulse that leads you to these decisions. And so I think that at that moment where we sort of were understood that we shouldn't just be categorizing them according to the morality of religion, but trying to understand it from a psychological and emotional perspective, that the divide showed up.
And I think just picking up what Michael said, there were lots of paths we could have taken. In some of the stories, we talk a lot about race and gender and the role of race and gender in the decisions that people made. And we could have had a book which was really only about these big societal trends and the impact of those on people and their mistakes. So we could have, to your question, come at it from religion, and ultimately we chose a different path. But that's not to suggest that we didn't think these societal trends were important, and it wasn't to suggest that we didn't think religion could help us understand what was happening. But, 250 pages seemed like a lot. So it would have been a lot longer book for everyone to endure if we'd embraced all those different paths.
Right. So obviously I read the book through the lens of my training and through what I've learned
Your
on
schemas.
My schemas.
Would you like to reveal any? Other than Judaism?
I'm trying to practice it's the E of duet and not overshare my stuff while I'm in conversation with
But now you have permission.
Fair enough.
That's true. He trapped me. Maybe it'll come
Okay,
up.
It I'll tell you one funny
You
thing.
didn't hear it when I was talking about perfectionism? You didn't
Okay,
hear
well,
anything there?
I was going to get there. We went on Wall Street Week with a guy named David Weston, who was very generous to have us. And David, to his credit, at one point we turned to him and said, David, why don't you tell us about one of your mistakes? And so for those of you who don't watch Wall Street Week regularly, you can go find it on YouTube. And there he is, David Weston, on air, decided to talk about one of his mistakes. And that was, from our perspective, gold. Because that was the moment where he's like, okay, if you guys are willing to go on national television and talk about it, I invited you here. Maybe I should be willing to do it too.
Now, admittedly, he had made a very
Let the
public
silence
mistake.
fall.
Yeah, Mike
okay,
bailed me out.
Yeah,
Michael
exactly.
bailed me out there.
No. Here we go.
Okay, I'm gonna keep the conversation in the Jewish framework, and maybe we'll see. We'll see. We've got about 20 minutes left. We'll see what comes up. So two aspects of, I think, Judaism's approach to the topics that you've written about that I want to present and have you react to and see in what ways they align or they're misaligned with the thinking that you've done on this topic. So the first has to do with the word sin itself, which I think is a word that you'll find in Jewish literature. It's a word you'll find in the High Holiday Machzor, but it's a word whose meaning has been overly impacted by the Christian definition of sin, so that when Jews interact with this term, there's a little bit of unlearning or pulling apart in order to understand what it is that we're talking about. Now, you wrote about there are different words for sin in Hebrew, but chet, which is probably the best known term, and is the one that's most commonly translated as sin, is actually connected to a Hebrew word, a Hebrew term that comes from the world of archery. So if you see how this verb is used in, for example, the book of Judges or the book of Kings, you'll see that it has the connotation of missing the mark, right? An archer who pulls back the arrow and who shoots and doesn't get the bullseye, but either misses the target altogether or, depending on how much of a perfectionist you are, hits the outer rings of the target. And to me, that is a very important distinction between how sin is understood in different religious traditions, because it locates sin as in the realm of human behavior, as opposed to the realm of essential character, right? Whereas in Christianity, we and I want to be humble about my understanding of Christian thought here, right? But with the concept like original sin, you have this notion that we are all inherently stained or sinful in some way, and the only way to redemption is through divine grace or through the acceptance of Jesus as Lord and Savior. I wasn't expecting to say that today at Shul, right?
I wasn't expecting to hear that.
Whereas in Judaism...
But I did study that too.
Yes, yes, Josh. Right, whereas in Judaism, because it's located in the realm of human behavior, right, it then gets attached to a whole process by which that behavior can be examined and then ultimately rectified, and doesn't say something essential about the human who committed the sin. There's an ability to differentiate between the sin and the sinner.
Right.
And so, got to figure out what the question is here. But
it was a good devar.
Thank
it was good.
You.
Thank you.
Right. But so as you sort of think about that adjustment to the definition of sin and understanding that as the way that Judaism really understands it, how is that either aligned or misaligned with your thinking on this topic?
Well, I think the piece that resonates certainly is the revelatory piece. I mean, we go to high holiday services and we recite the Al-Khair, and there's a long list there. I mean, a long list. And speaking for myself, happily, not every one of them resonates, but invariably a bunch of them do, right? Foolish talk always comes up, and maybe you now understand why. It depends on your translation, but that's the one that always resonates, for me at least, most. So I think that part of that really resonates as it relates to our book is that revelatory piece. It's that process of reading that over and over again on Yom Kippur and thinking to yourself, okay, which parts of these things are true about me? And the process of thinking about it and revealing it to Hashem in that way, I think is very powerful. And those are obviously more serious in some respects. Some of them are very serious than what we wrote about. We didn't write in this book about really tragic events like someone who's drinking and then kills someone when he's driving. So not those times of tragedies, but serious mistakes. So I think that revelatory piece really resonates, and the notion that we all carry that within us, and none of us, to your point, are perfect.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to add anything?
No, I think that's right. And this notion also that there's something at the core that is responsible for this stuff.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So the other prevailing paradigm is, of course, tshuva. I couldn't read your book without thinking about tshuva, which is sometimes, again, the sort of the inadequacy of translation is sometimes translated as repentance, but has a lot to do with return. Tshuva linked to the verb lashuv, to return, right? And so that sets up an interesting question, right? When you need to repent for something, to what or to whom are you returning? And the Jewish answer to that question would be that you are returning to God. You're hopefully returning into right relationship with the person that you've harmed. And you're also returning to something essential, an essential goodness that lies within. And all of those are part of the process of tshuva. But tshuva is, there's legal definitions around this process. I mean, the most famous of them come from Maimonides. And I just want to read, the 6 steps that Rambam articulates as the laws of tshuva, and to ask you to think about how those steps manifested in your processes. So the first step is stopping the sin. Right? You can't continue to sin and be in a process of tshuva. If you're continuing to make the same mistakes over and over again, you haven't actually started yet. Number two, there has to be regret for what you've done. There has to be genuine emotional sense that what you did was wrong and you understand that it was wrong. There has to be a commitment not to repeat the mistake to the best of our ability. Then there has to be a verbal confession out loud, both to the person who you harmed and to God. One has to repair harm to others, right? So if there was a financial loss that someone suffered as a result of one's mistake, part of the tshuva process is restitution, is to help that person reclaim the assets that were lost to them. If there was an emotional toll, then it's a complicated question. How do you help that person be repaired in the harm that was done to them? And then lastly, what's called tshuva gemura is demonstrate change when one finds oneself in the same situation down the road, to then not make the same mistake twice. And then that sort of completes the process of tshuva. So how do those 6 steps...
I wish the Rambam had a good acronym.
Yeah.
Because that would help me remember all of them.
You know, my initial reaction to it, to be fair, is I don't agree with the first few steps.
Great.
Based on what we've been
How
doing.
Jewish, Michael.
So I think by way of example, the first step is to actually recognize that you've made a mistake.
Mm-hmm.
I think most people, myself included, don't even understand when we've made a mistake, and that's part of the process. I think once you have, or once you do understand you've made a mistake, to feel regret is not an issue, because most everybody I know, myself included, feel enormous regret and shame. The question is, how do you not get rid of that, but somehow deal with it? And so I'm not, to provoke people to feel regret, I don't think is a necessary action. Mm-hmm. So just in terms of those first 2 steps, that I wouldn't agree with. Mm-hmm. I don't know about you.
You know, there are pieces of which obviously resonate. I mean, I think the speaking aloud piece, which is a version of what we've done in the book, right, that definitely resonates. But I think there's a lot written about apology, and there are very good books on it. But I think the essence, for me, of apology is if there isn't some cost to the person issuing the apology, it's probably not a sincere apology, mm-hmm. right? There has to be an acknowledgement. There has to be some element of this which is painful. Otherwise, there's a line that a friend of mine used, which I sort of like, which is, it's not charity if it doesn't hurt. And I was thinking about that in the context of something else that we were reading this morning, which is to say that I'm sure many members of your congregation, all the people here, are very generous, and we all, give in different ways. But if there's never a moment it's like, ugh, that's uncomfortable, is it really charity? And apologies, I think, are somewhat similar. There has to be a cost to it. So that piece, I think, resonates for me the most.
Yeah. I'll ask you one more question, and then we'll turn it over to you all to ask questions of Josh and Michael. And thank you again for your honesty.
By the way, you're not doing a building campaign or anything, are you?
I thought about taking the
I was going to say, I just think
opportunity right there, but I didn't want to be accused of anything here. What traditional Jewish sources don't speak a whole lot about, but I was very moved to see coming up again and again in your book. And we do find them in some of the later 19th, 20th century Jewish sources, Rav Kook specifically, is the notion of self-forgiveness.
Yeah.
Right? And how crucial it is in this whole process, it is to forgive yourself. Can you tell us a little bit about what it took for you to get there, and what advice you might have for us sitting in this room who are struggling to access that point of forgiveness?
Let me speak for myself on that one, and Josh should comment, obviously, on his own. I think time definitely helped me, but I would say that the most important aspect to it is I kept it in my head. I didn't talk to anybody about it. I didn't talk to my wife about it. I didn't talk to my children about it. And to have somebody who I could really trust who I knew that was going to sit there and not judge me and not throw me under the bus when I really went into this part of my life that, quite honestly, I hadn't spoken to anybody about. I'm now referring to when I was 8 or 9 years old living in Holland. That to me was breathtakingly helpful, because all of a sudden I could speak about it openly, and in the process of doing that, I got to self-forgiveness. I really did. It gave me an objectivity on what I'd done, and it made me understand that it didn't have the sort of import that I'd given it.
I think it's so hard. You know, I think we're all constantly balancing between the desire to use the passive tense, this, you know, in the sense this was done or this happened to me, and then sometimes we're erring way on the other side, like I'm so culpable, I'm so responsible. I was talking to a member of your congregation right after services, was going through a hard time with a child, and there's this temptation for all of us to take that on ourselves, and then there's a recognition that, you know, our children are individuals, and it's partly a function of genetics, and it's partly a function of environment. And so we can't absent ourselves and pretend that we didn't have any influence or that we didn't make mistakes. And at the same time, a recognition that there are larger forces at work at times. Yeah. And that balance, I think, is very hard for all of us. And, you know, one thing I'll say about it is, as it relates to our children, whenever I'm in the mode of being too apologetic for all the mistakes, they're like, enough already. You're just looking for praise, so stop it. And they're right. And so I think it's important to be able to figure ourselves, and it's hard.
Yeah. I'll give Rav Kook a word here, and Orota Tshuva, which is an incredible collection of writings on Tshuva, the light of Tshuva. He writes, a person may fall in spirit because of their sins until they come to despise themselves. And this is one of the great obstacles in the service of God. Right? That if we can remember that there is a Elohai neshama shenatata bi, there's a pure soul, right, that lives within me, that because we're human, accumulates schmutz over the course of the year. You might just
tell what you told us in our call about the difference between the scholar and the righteous man and the one who's made mistakes.
Yeah, so there's a passage in the Gemara that says that, you know, a Baal Tshuva, one who a penitent, right, one who has had the experience of making a mistake and then repenting and returning through the act of tshuva, can stand in a place that a tzaddik gamur, a completely righteous person, cannot stand in. Right? Meaning that the lessons learned, right, the meaning derived, extracted from the experience of having messed up, but then going through the process of regretting and acknowledging and confessing and apologizing and determining to do differently in the future, gives one a perspective that someone who has not messed up cannot have. And from that place that the penitent stands, the healing that is possible, not just for themselves, but the people who are in their orbit, is different and maybe even superior. And I mean, it reminds me of the image, right, on the cover of your book. Maybe you'll say a word about what this image means to you, and then we'll really turn it over.
You should talk about the image. You were the one who came up with it in the first place.
An image is kintsugi, which is a Japanese art form which came from the 15th century. A shogun who had a Chinese vase which broke, and he sent it back to China to get it repaired. It came back with a series of ugly staples, and he was unsurprisingly unsatisfied with that repair job. And he turned it over to his artisans, who then used gold inlay as a way of fixing it. And it was really meant to, I think, capture two important ideas that we've talked about. One is that imperfections can add to beauty. Those of you who are married or in relationships, you'll know what I'm talking about. And the second is acceptance, that things aren't going to go perfectly, and we have to accept the fact that things will break, and that hopefully, assuming it's not tragic, it will be okay.
All right, thank you to Josh and Michael. We're going to clap for you multiple times.
Thank you.
And we have time for some questions. Let's start over here with Amy, visiting from the East Coast.
Visiting from Washington, D.C., sorry.
Nicer weather here.
Yeah, right, in many ways. Does regret lead to shame, or does shame lead to regret? Could you talk about the differences and similarities?
I mean, in my case, regret led to shame, and then I just stuck on shame, I would argue. And that's what I was in the middle of for a very long time. I've never really thought about that question, which comes first, where's the chicken and where's the egg? But for me, that would be the case. Where are you on that one?
I don't have a good answer. I think we spend a lot of time thinking about the difference between embarrassment and shame, where embarrassment is where someone else has seen the thing that you've done. And so when you run into that person, you're embarrassed because you don't want to see her because she's seen you do something. In the case of shame, it's how you feel about yourself. And so when you do something or think about something shameful, no one has to see it in order for you to feel very badly. And I think going back to the al-Hate, that's the very powerful part about that confession, which is even if no one's seen you and even no other person has seen you, the expectation is Hashem has, and therefore you're asking for forgiveness.
Sean. And Susan is coming around with the microphone, and if she just moves the mic, then the folks who are streaming can hear the question as well.
So I can't resist saying that Ki Tisa was my daughter's Torah portion, and her answer was that Egel means young bull, which was the symbol of the Egyptian prince, and Moses was a prince of Egypt. So the people replaced Moses, and Moses came down the mountain and saw himself and freaked out.
You have
so
a
they
smart
both,
daughter.
Yeah,
they both
very.
made mistakes. Well, she's into classics. So, but it leads to my question. I had a chance to read only the first little bit of the book this morning. You both were operating in organizational cultures. And I personally was interning at the Clinton White House in the summer of 1993 and gestures broadly. What lessons do you wish collectives, organizations would learn from your book? Not just in terms of crisis comms, but in terms of how to navigate it when individual parts of those organizations inevitably make mistakes.
I mean, there's a whole, we didn't even go into it in the book, but both of us could do, I'm sure, a long bit on crisis containment and how do you react quickly in the moment. For me, what I'm trying to get at in the book, let me back up for a minute. When there was an excerpt of the book that was published, my story in the Wall Street Journal, and the response that came out of this town, because this is the town that paid the most attention, given that it was about the movie industry, was sort of twofold. One was, why would you do that? But the bigger version was, I'm so glad that you actually said what you said, and I feel very similar to you about, wanting to be part of the group. And I think, for me, the lesson in that was, I wished in our organization, and now I do it more in the organizations I'm involved with, people actually admitted to the mistakes they make, particularly in the senior group of people inside of the organization. And that does model, because all of a sudden when you say you've made the mistake and you can actually talk about why you might have made that mistake, it gives license to other people to do the same, and then you're much less likely to have a repetition of it over and over and over again.
The only thing I would add is that part of what we write about is the idea of the wise mind, which is a term that came out of cognitive behavioral therapy. And it's really an expression of the fact that the best decisions are made when you can combine your emotional and intellectual side. System 1 and System 2, whatever you want to think about it, Captain Kirk and Spock. And I think the difficulty is that we think these organizations are only intellectual entities. My wife, who's heard me on my side of endless business calls over the years, constantly is reflecting on the fact that it's like all about people and about emotion and personality, and so much of my life as an investor is actually trying to unpack how people feel and getting them to work together and getting the CEO to work with the CFO, et cetera. And I think in these organizations, we all expect people to be always acting rationally all the time. And that's just not realistic. And so I think if leaders are willing to say, of course you're going to bring your emotional life to this. And that's very natural, but let's just try to separate the two, think about how you apply them both effectively, and not let one of them run amok.
Really interesting conversation. It sounds like a fascinating book for both of you, but for Michael, like defining a mistake, you made there was an amusing project that you liked, and it was funny, and you liked the crowd. It would have required incredible prescience for you to know what would happen. So how do you sort of characterize it as a mistake, so to speak? I mean, movies are a gut decision to begin with, So how is it classified for both of you? And then you were subpoenaed, and you did the right thing. So just how does it become a mistake exactly?
So the time I realized it was a mistake was, it's in the book, but basically what happens is I, in the middle of the hack, go to New York to go on Fareed Zakaria's show, and in the middle of that, President Obama, before I go on the show, comes out and criticizes us for not releasing the movie. He was mistaken in that because we were trying to release the movie. And then I go on and correct him. And 10 days later, he rang me up and he apologized. But he said, in what world would you not think of when you kill the leader of a hostile nation in a movie, wouldn't you consider that to be a mistake? And so it's more about that particular thing, particularly when you see it through the context of, I was working for the Sony Corporation. The Japanese have a very particular relationship with North Korea, which I hadn't realized. And so in the normal course of things, we would have had a public policy person at the table. We would have had the general counsel at the table. All of those people would have weighed in and said, hang on, let's look at this first before we say yes in the moment.
I would just say quickly, you're sitting next to Gene Sperling, who is a senior member of the Clinton, Obama, and Biden administrations, and probably the person I would say Bob Rubin trusts the most on the intersection of policy and politics. And Bob Rubin has this line, which is, don't judge a decision by its outcome, which is a little bit, I think, what you're saying. I think he's right, and happily I'm sure he's not listening. I think he's a little wrong, which is to say that even if my diary had not been disclosed, it's still a dopey thing to do. Like when something's being investigated, when it's the source of huge controversy, don't write about it in your personal diary. Like that's probably not the right place. It's okay to process your emotions one way or another, but don't make references to specific meetings and what people allegedly had said or not. That's just unwise, even if it never gets disclosed. So I may have gotten a little bit unlucky in the sense that it ultimately got disclosed, but it was still a mistake regardless of whether it got disclosed.
Jonathan, one second. Mike will come over.
So one of the questions that pops in my mind is you're talking about like the overlay of Jewish thought or Jewish whatever, and I'm curious what your thoughts are about Yetzer Hara and Yetzer Tov, like the things you're supposed to do and not supposed to do relative to this idea of mistakes. And I get that in a perfect world, like you just would never do the things you're not supposed to do, but in a mistake, like where does all that come together in your mind in terms of that idea?
I'll start, and then Michael should jump in. We've thought about this a lot, and one of the things that's really interesting is if you ask people at the end of their lives what they regret the most, 75% of people choose the things that they did not do, not the things they did do. And regret is actually, generally speaking, deepest as you get to the end of your life about ideas you didn't pursue, interests you didn't have a chance to experience, relationships that you didn't repair. It's that regret. And since we're in this town, you're using a movie metaphor. If you think about On the Waterfront, at the end of the movie, he says, I could have been a contender. Think about how less powerful that is if he said, I should have been a contender. And that thing about like when you do something because you think you're supposed to, it's that you should do, is just not nearly as emotionally powerful as when it's aspiring or trying to get something done. And in the book, there are a bunch of stories about people who made choices. Their possible selves ended up in one direction versus the other, and they have a lot of regret about that choice.
Yeah, that's it.
I think I should tell you used the word FOMO before, and you have FOBO in the book as well. I want to teach you about the acronym SHLOMO. Do you know about that?
I don't.
Well, so SHLOMO is the sheer love of missing out, as opposed to the fear,
I love
the
that.
fear of missing
That's
out.
good.
And it requires a kind of a settledness in self, right, to actually inhabit.
That's how you got
SHLOMO.
through rabbinical school.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. So, Michael and Josh, we spared you the traditional opening of the Lunch and Learn. I did not read your bios. I didn't do that. But I'm not going to spare you the traditional end of a Lunch and Learn at IKAR, which is a blessing. So I'd like to bless the two of you. Well, first and foremost, I want to bless you that your friendship continue to grow. That as you travel around the world having conversations about this book, you continue to learn about yourselves and learn about each other, and that it brings you and your families closer to one another so that you feel that there is an ongoing, growing, evolving duet between the two of you, which pushes you further and further into the truth that you desire. And the second piece of that is that I want to bless you that you're able in this process to distinguish between what becomes a kind of practiced vulnerability, which I know from my own life. There's certain stories about my own life I'm comfortable sharing, and it's a little bit vulnerable, and it signals to people this guy's willing to talk about his mistakes. But there's growth from practiced vulnerability into dynamic, live, real vulnerability, and that as you continue to speak about this and as you continue to dig into this topic, you continue to access new places of vulnerability that pushes your understanding of who you are and who we are called to be even further and further, and that the fruits of your labor is felt by this community and beyond, and that we move into those spaces as well. Thank you both so much for being here.
Thank you.
Shabbat shalom. Thanks, everyone.
Shabbat shalom. Thank you, Rabbi. That was wonderful. That was great. Thank you.